This is a video for globalization for the Edexcel A-level specification starting in 2016, and it's based on the inquiry question number 1, what are the causes of globalization and why has it accelerated in recent decades? So the first part of the spec states that you need to know 5 main globalization flows. These are commodities, information, tourists, migrants, and capital. So all of these contribute to accelerating globalization. So commodities contribute to this because raw materials have always been traded, but the trade in manufactured goods have risen rapidly. So basically what this means is that obviously crops have always been traded, they've always been around, but obviously with increasing globalization, with increasing resources, we've been able to manufacture more goods and, get them transported from China, from all over the world, really. And in fact, in 2015, the global GDP was 80 trillion US dollars, and the flow of commodities contributed to a third of this. So you can see how much of an influence the flows of commodities have had on globalization. And as well as that, information. So because of the increase in technology, people have been able to communicate in real time, for example, through Facebook and other forms of social media. And in 2015, there are 1.5 billion Facebook users. Tourists as well, budget airlines such as AirAsia or Ryanair, EasyJet, they have allowed people in emerging countries, so those BRIC countries, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they've been allowed to travel more. And in fact, in 2014, in China alone, there are 120 million outbound flights. So 120 million outbound flights means that so many people have been able to travel to Europe, to other places in Asia, to the Americas. So that's also increased globalization. Migrants. There used to be many border obstacles preventing them from migrating, but a lot of these have been removed. For example, in the EU, there is a Schengen agreement, and basically this removes all borders between the countries who have signed to this, so it promotes freedom of movement. So if you drive from Portugal to Germany, for example, you'll be able to get from one place to the other without having to stop at any forms of border control. However, some countries still enforce strict regulations, such as in Qatar, you need to have a certain type of visa. Not everyone's allowed to enter, but there are exceptions. For example, in Qatar, there's a high demand for Indian construction workers, so they're pretty much able to migrate to Qatar, no problem, purely because it is high demand for Indian construction workers. And capital, which is basically the fancy way of saying money, it's where money is constantly passed through worldwide stock markets, where businesses, I meant to say can here, not and. Let me just write that in somehow. They can basically exchange currencies for profits. So, oh god, that's terrible. That's supposed to be can. So, say there's an English company, they might buy a few 100,000 euros and then sell it in dollars, depending on the exchange rates and how they can make a profit when they convert it back into pounds. So, all of these 5 flows have contributed to globalization in one form or another, either through trading more goods or businesses being able to communicate in real time instead of having to send letters or travel that takes just too long. Tourists, there's been a lot more cultural spread, cultural diffusion, and migrants as well. So tourists and migrants kind of link, and they're sharing and they're sharing resources of other countries, and capital as well. It's the basis of the global economy, essentially. So yeah, all of these have contributed to increasing globalization in one form or another, socially, culturally, politically, or economically. So next, development in trade and transport, they've also contributed to increasing globalization. So steam power, in the 1800s, Britain was the world's superpower, and when you get onto A2, you may study superpowers. I mean, no, you will study superpowers. So basically, just sort of a background to that. You don't have to put it in the exam for globalization, but you could to get extra marks. Basically, Britain was the world's superpower, and the world was unipolar. So that means there was only one country that led the world essentially in terms of power, and that was Britain. And they kick-started the use of steam trains and ships because obviously in the 1800s there was the Industrial Revolution. So these steam trains and ships, they provided routes to Asia and to Europe. So obviously a lot more trade, travel could occur. I mean, it did take a while, but it did kickstart this whole trade and transport system we have nowadays. Also railways. Railway networks have expanded globally since the 1800s, and for example, the Trans-Siberian Railway that connects Moscow to China and to Japan, and that is a massive distance, but it really is effective in accelerating globalization because a lot more trade and transport is able to happen. Also, the Boeing 747, I feel, is probably one of the most important because since the 1960s, a lot more planes have been flown, and it has allowed travel to occur more often, a lot more trade, all of that really. And also containerization, where there are intermodal containers that are used, and it transports pretty much everything in the world to be transported. I mean, you know, you've got chicken or sofas or TVs or potatoes, anything really transported in one of these intermodal containers, and there are 200 million movements of these annually. So they travel, and obviously there are massive oceans. You've got the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, there's the Indian Ocean, lots of oceans that connect loads of countries together. So just China across the Pacific Ocean to America, and you can trade a lot of things between those two countries. And all of these have led to the shrinking world effect. And this is basically the whole aspect that the world is feeling a lot more smaller because of communication in real time, because of being able to transport things a lot quicker, because of being able to travel a lot more quicker. I mean, for example, before, if you wanted to go from the UK to America, you'd have to take a 3 to 4 week boat journey across the Atlantic Ocean. But now you can take an 8 to 10 hour flight, so it feels a lot more closer. And also, if you want to send a letter, if you want to say something to someone in another country, instead of writing a letter and waiting months to hear back from another person, just send a message to them and it'll be with them within a second. So all of this communication in real time and being able to transport things a lot more quicker, it all contributes to accelerating globalization. Also, development in technology. Obviously, technology it plays a massive role in our lives nowadays. Everything around us is technology based, especially the telephone, for example, which allows people in developing countries. So in GCSE you would have used LEDC, less economically developed country, but at AS and A level you need to use developing countries. And this term leapfrog, it basically means that they don't use a landline, they don't use anything less than a mobile phone. They just jump straight to mobile phone use because it's so efficient for them. And in Kenya and Africa, for example, there is a phone network called Safaricom. And in 2007, they released this software called M-Pesa. And that's basically sort of like a credit card service that's used on phones. And it's been really efficient in developing Kenya's economy, the society, because male farmers, for example, because obviously the majority of farmers there are male, there is still this gender inequality there. The male farmers have been able to check market prices for crops or for fish or any agricultural products they produce. They're able to check market prices before they actually sell their products. People in urban areas have been able to pay utility bills, pay school fees, and women in rural areas have been able to take loans from development banks because M-Pesa has been used as a form of a good credit score. So yeah, the telephone that actually started off as a telegraph cables laid across oceans has developed into this mobile phone use that is pretty efficient for everyone. GPS, Global Positioning System, it allows global production systems to be managed efficiently with the use of vehicle tracking systems. So massive TNCs, transnational corporations, they have headquarters and factories based in all sorts of countries around the world. So they're able to manage their companies, manage their deliveries efficiently just by the use of global positioning systems. And there are currently 24 GPS satellite dishes that are laid 10,000 kilometers above the Earth. So this has been particularly useful in developing TNCs and allowing more trade to happen because the GPS satellites have made everything a lot more efficient. Also broadband, TNC such as Google, they own a part of this 1 million kilometers worth of fiber optic cables which are laid across the ocean floor. And these fiber optic cables, they convey large amounts of data from one place to another in a really, really short space of time, which obviously, again, has allowed people to communicate in real time and allow different bases of TNCs in different countries to communicate in real time to manage their company more efficiently. And finally, internet, which plays a massive role in our lives nowadays. It was actually developed during the Cold War as an ARPANET system, and it connected research computers together to allow people, and it has continued to allow people to connect daily. So, through social media, Facebook, Skype, you can speak to people in real time and see their face and hear their voice. So it's pretty cool because you're able to speak to people in real time, and pretty much all of these forms of technology have contributed to increasing globalization. And now we've got IGOs. You don't need to know such detail about them, but you need to know just the basics, the advantages, disadvantages, and an example of what they have done to contribute to an increase in globalization. So the WTO, advantages of them is that they want to get rid of poverty, they want to abandon protectionist attitudes, they want to stabilize the economy, and they want to help trade blocs function. However, people believe that they want capitalists to grow, so these G8 and G7 countries that have a voice, such as the UK, the USA, Germany, and it also harms the LEDC farmers, so farmers in the developing countries, because it then prevents subsidization of MEDC farmers. And an example of this is that the USA, they subsidize a lot of their agricultural production, and this harms farmers in developing countries such as Ghana or Congo, because they're not able to sell their stock, because the USA have a lot of money to be able to subsidize their crops and therefore sell them at a cheaper price. However, a good example of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, here it mentions abandoning protectionist attitudes. They have asked China to remove restriction of their rare earth materials in 2014 so that more countries have access to these and are able to purchase them. Next, we've got the World Bank, and they basically just want to get rid of poverty, and the way that they've done this is by eradicating river blindness and polio in Niger. However, they do have a lot of austerity measures. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they lend money to stabilize economies, such as in 1982 there was a Mexican debt crisis, and the USA, who have a massive voice in the IMF, they lent them $3.8 billion to resolve this crisis. And the USA has a massive role in these intergovernmental organizations, because they were actually founded after the World War II in Bretton Woods in America, in the USA, to prevent returning to the conditions of the Great Depression in the 1930s, which affected the global economy, especially in the USA, massively. And an example of the IMF's austerity measures is that Congo had a $12 billion debt, and they had no way to repay it. So the IMF lent them the money in exchange for the IMF privatizing Congo's oil. So Congo have had no say in their oil infrastructure, so as long as they're able to repay their $12 billion debt. So the IMF have completely taken over Congo's oil infrastructure. Next, national government attitudes. There are three main types of government attitudes. These are neoliberalism, privatization, and business startups. neoliberalism is basically just another word for free market liberalization, and an example is the UK's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and this basically, they tend to favour government intervention, which does actually slow down economic development, which increases wealth and leads to trickle down. So this increase in wealth, it just sort of like trickles down, spreads slowly to poorer areas, and it basically reduces the income inequality between the rich and poor. So that's pretty effective in accelerating globalization, because it's not a massive economic growth, and even though that might sound pretty good, eventually it does become out of control and may lead to hyperinflation. So Margaret Thatcher favorizing this form of a government attitude. In London in 1986, there was a removal of red tape. So government intervention, they got involved, they removed the red tape, and the City of London is now a global hub where millions and millions of pounds are passed through their stock market every day. So right now, as you're watching this, there are millions of pounds being transferred through the City of London right now. The next one, privatization. This is basically allowing foreign investors to gain a stake in a country's infrastructure to lower costs. And an example of this is Heathrow Airport in London, and China actually owns 10% of Heathrow because it was too expensive for the UK's government to maintain. And lastly, business startups. So a fall in taxes or different regulations, it allows smaller and local companies to make profits because there's not a massive influence and takeover of TNCs. And an example, in Italy, they've eased their restriction on China textile companies starting up there. And actually, the Italian city of Prato, it actually has the largest Chinese population in Europe. So now trade blocs, they play a massive role in increasing globalization. And the way they do this is basically because they basically eliminate tariffs between different countries who are part of a trade bloc. And the two trade blocs we're going to focus on are the European Union and ASEAN. And the main difference between them is that the European Union, it is quite a developed trade bloc. It's got a lot of MEDCs in there. You've got Germany, you've got Spain, you've got France, you've got the UK. So those are the core countries that you learned at GCSE, and you've also got periphery countries. You've got Romania, you've got Poland, you've got Bulgaria. So you've got sort of periphery countries and core countries, and put together they share lots of skills, and they are a very developed trade bloc. So the way that the European Union benefits is that 70 million extra customers started going to Tesco in 2004 because 10 new countries joined. So Poland, for example, and also in countries such as France. This is supposed to be another sentence. In France, they have the perfect climate and perfect soil to produce wine, which is largely consumed worldwide, especially in Europe. So France benefits from that. Also, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, if I can remember well, I'll put that in the description below. I think it is. They've been helping farmers since 1992, and the EU has also had their own currency since 2002 as well. So all of these factors have contributed to increasing globalization, because obviously this means there's more migration, there are more people paying taxes, and it's benefiting the UK because obviously Tesco's in the UK. French wine producers are making more profit because they have the perfect soil and climate for that. Farmers are also benefiting because of the Common Agricultural Policy. It is Common Agricultural Policy. They've been helping them since 1992, and also their own currency shows that the economy is pretty strong. But they also do suffer, and they have had to place quotas on certain imports, such as in 2006. The EU's production of underwear was jeopardized because of such a large Chinese imports of underwear. So they've had to place quotas on that. But besides that, there are pretty much no problems with the EU. And also, one of the main benefits is the freedom of movement because of the Schengen Agreement, which I mentioned earlier. However, ASEAN, it's a trade bloc. It's an emerging trade bloc, NIC. You've got countries such as Philippines, Indonesia. They actually don't have. China's actually not part of ASEAN, but they do have a trade partnership where they can trade with no taxes, and that's pretty good for both, for China and for ASEAN, especially for ASEAN because obviously China is such a strong economy at the moment. So it's good that they have this tax-free trade between them. They also want to form a single market. They promote peace. The countries that are part of ASEAN, they must not use nuclear weapons. And the combination of their skills, such as call centers in Philippines and factories in like Vietnam, for example, the sharing of skills and different levels of development, they have contributed to increasing globalization because they are becoming a lot more powerful. So some similarities between the EU and ASEAN is that they both promote freedom of trade. They have zero tariffs between them. However, the EU has its own currency and it has its own free movement of people, whereas ASEAN, they don't have free movement of people, and they also have no currency, and they also have a lower economic development. But aside from that, these are two pretty strong trade blocs, and ASEAN, it is developing these emerging countries because obviously their economy is rising and they play a large part in increasing globalization nowadays. Next, we've got China's open door policy, and this was introduced in 1978 by Deng Xiaoping, and one of the first things they'd done was the agricultural reforms, so farmers were now allowed to make a small profit, so it's sort of eliminating China's communist views, and also the one-child policy. On the one hand, it's not beneficial to families, it does cause a lot of family trauma, but then again, it's slowing down population growth, and that is beneficial because if the population is too high and there's not enough resources to provide for everyone, it will lead to conflict, it will lead to tension, and it will lead to an increase in poverty. In 1980, Shenzhen started to accept foreign direct investment, which actually now generates 50% of China's total GDP. So, and actually between 2015 and 2025, FDI in Shenzhen is expected to be at an estimated $1.25 trillion. So China being more open to FDI, to foreign direct investment, offshoring, outsourcing, it is pretty beneficial in increasing globalization, especially because China has got such a strong economy. And actually, just to explain what outsourcing and offshoring is when TNCs have their factories or production based in other countries. So a TNC such as, I don't know, Nike, it's got its headquarters in the USA, in Oregon, but it has its factories in China, in Vietnam. So because of to make use of their resources. So China, TNCs do outsource there a lot, and it is increasing China's economy. And so offshoring is pretty similar. It's moving factories to other countries to reduce labor and other costs. So yeah, they're pretty similar. Outsourcing is actually contracting another company in the country. So Nike do contract one of China's companies to produce their trainers, their shirts, and offshoring is just moving their factories and process to another country to reduce costs. So pretty similar. So yeah, and then from 1980 to nowadays, it's still continuing. There's been mass migration with 400 million people escaping poverty, and yeah, so since the open door policy has been introduced, 400 million people escaped poverty, but 300 million people actually left rural areas. And on the one hand, this is good because people are benefiting from better quality of life, but it is also causing cultural erosion, it's causing traditions to fall, which is why in rural areas there is a hukou sort of registration system, a census that we have here, and it prevents villages from emptying because they don't let everyone leave the rural areas. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and as I said previously, because of the WTO, they have agreed to reduce their restrictions on selling rare earth materials. And in 2004, as I said again, they signed an agreement with ASEAN to trade freely. So, so the ability to trade freely, to export more goods, to reduce poverty, increasing foreign direct investment, allowing agricultural farmers to benefit economically, and the one-child policy, again, reducing poverty because of less population density. It has all contributed to increasing globalization because there are benefits either economically, environmentally, socially, culturally, politically. One way or another, there are benefits. But as always, there are negatives to this policy as well. China haven't actually completely abandoned their communist views. For example, only 34 foreign films showed annually in Chinese cinemas, and there is very little access to social media. They actually can't use Facebook, but there is their own version of Facebook in China, and it's called Youku. So that's how China's open door policy has pretty much contributed to increasing globalization. And we also need to know what the AT Kearney Index and the KOF Index is. The AT Kearney Index, it ranks cities based on business activity, cultural experience, and political engagement, whereas the KOF Index ranks countries using economic, political, social, and cultural globalization. So there's not much more we need to know for that. That's pretty much it. In the exam, you'll probably just get an example of one of these. I couldn't actually find a good example, but there should be some in the textbooks that you've got if you have one. So yeah, that's all you pretty much need to know. And the last bit is about TNCs. So with TNCs, transnational corporations, obviously, as I said before, Nike, they have their headquarters in Oregon, in the USA, but not all areas have suitable sites of production, so they can't benefit from FDI, which is why Nike have offshored their processes to China, and they've outsourced as well to reduce labor costs. And some TNCs, they merge with foreign TNCs to create global businesses by outsourcing instead of offshoring. Large TNCs, such as BMW's Mini, they form a global production network, which I'll get onto that next. So it's basically it's just sort of like you've got a TNC, and then you've got some countries producing raw materials to make the goods, then you've got another country with factories to produce it, then you've got other countries which sort of sort out all the economy-based stuff. So a lot of countries just sort of come together as one global production network, and they produce a product to be sold on the market. So if we take Mini, for example, the windscreens are made in Belgium, the engine is made in Brazil, the radiators are made in Germany, the exhaust systems are made in the UK, the wheels are made in Italy, and the bonnet is made in the Netherlands. So you can see that BMW's Mini, it does actually involve a lot of developed countries. You've got Belgium's a developed country, Brazil's an emerging country, Germany developed, UK developed, Italy developed, Netherlands developed. But generally, the materials used to make a windscreen or engine or radiator or wheels or bonnet, exhaust system, it will come from emerging or even developing countries which produce the raw materials. And some TNCs, such as McDonald's, they use globalization to expand the market. So globalization, it's adjusting your products to meet the needs and the demands of another country. So McDonald's, here in the UK, we've got a Mac chicken sandwich, we have a Big Mac, we have cheeseburgers, quarter pounders. But if you go to India, you most likely will not see a Big Mac, because obviously they don't eat beef, but you will see something called a Maharaja Mac, which is an Indian form of a burger at McDonald's. If you go to Canada, you'll see a Mac Lobster, which I don't think you'd ever see a Mac Lobster in the UK. But yeah, so globalization is this whole aspect of developing and adjusting your products to meet the needs of another country. And lastly, switched off places, the Sahel region. Lack of management over control in the colonial times has led to sort of a collapse in the economy, which has not increased globalization. Lack of coastline puts trade partners off, because it's quite awkward to get to countries in the Sahel region, because there's a lot of mountains, there's no coastline, so it's pretty hard to get there. Also, desertification and other extreme environmental conditions. It also leads to a lack of agricultural production, which obviously can't be traded. And conflict due to a link with Al-Qaeda has led to a lot of political tension. And as well as that, dependency on OECD countries for flows of food aid. Obviously, it shows that these countries in the Sahel region, they're not able to function on their own. Because if you see here, environmental conditions, it obviously increases the cost of providing infrastructure. Lack of coastline, it just doesn't attract FDI, because it's quite awkward and hard to get there. But however, in the future, in the next decade, in a few decades, next century, the Sahel region should start contributing to increasing globalization, because the neighboring country, Nigeria, has been increasing a massive growth in, a massive increase in economic growth. And also Mali, which is one of the countries in the Sahel region, their folk musicians have a massive following on YouTube. So believe it or not, they are quite famous on social media. So at some point they should start contributing to globalization, but at the moment they are known as a switched off place, because they just don't contribute to globalization at all. So that was the inquiry question of globalization. Inquiry question number 1 of globalization. I've got a quick quiz here just to recap everything, if you'd like to do so. So if you'd like to do so, press pause now. And here are the answers. How many Facebook users were there in 2015? 1.5 billion. When was ARPANET created? During the Cold War. How many countries joined the EU in 2004? Give an example. 10, including Poland. Does the AT Kearney Index rank countries or cities? It ranks cities. Which terror group is linked to the Sahel region, which causes conflict? Al-Qaeda. So you obviously won't get questions like this, just 1-mark questions. But these facts, they do make a difference in your 12 markers, your assessed questions. So so put that in, you might get an extra mark or 2. It's just those little things that make a difference. So thanks for watching. If you have any more recommendations, comment below. I'll try to get to you soon. So thanks for watching, and see you again.